back to my channel. Today I want to talk about the day I finally met my mother. So this channel is a reflection on that experience of reuniting with my parents, finding my roots, and discovering my truth. So yeah, when I first knew that I was adopted, I was around the age of 11, maybe 12. And it was a shock to me at that age. It was a huge shock, even though my parents and I don't share the same appearance. Brother and I are black, and my parents are white. Well, I'm mixed race, and it should have been probably clear at that point. It was not. To me, I mean, you believe what the world tells you. I mean, I had questions, but nobody answered those. So, yeah, you just take what's given to you. Yeah. And when I was around that age, and finally my mother told me, I had tons of questions that I was afraid to ask. So fast forward to 14. When I was 14 years old, I finally received a phone call. Well, I answered the phone, and I pretended to be my parents. And the lady on the other phone line asked me if I would give permission for my daughter to be contacted by her biological mother. And in my pretend adult voice, I gave permission. My parents haven't been home, so, they didn't know. And during that time, my father was really sick. He was in the hospital, and there was little attention paid to us. So, yeah. So after I gave permission, I waited, and I finally received a letter in the mail. In that letter, and during that time, my aunt and uncle were staying with us because my parents couldn't parent due to my father's illness. And I remember they had given us some sort of restrictions, and we didn't obey them. So I had been locked in my room. So anyhow, I was locked in my room, but the mail was addressed to me. So my uncle just kind of tossed the mail inside my room. And, I was opening the mail, and I saw her picture, and I saw her CD. So yeah, I knew immediately who it was at the time. Once I opened the letter, it was pretty clear. And I remember just sitting on the ground, just, yeah, sort of in shock and awe and disbelief, and she was writing me in English, so it was kind of hard for me to read at that age because I didn't really speak English. And the CD, well, actually, it was a cassette tape. That's right, it was a cassette tape. So I put the cassette tape in, and I played play, on my little recorder. And it was just amazing to hear her voice. It sounded so familiar, and then also so strange, Yeah, so that was my first encounter. And I held on to this information for a long time. I didn't talk to anybody about it. And so, yeah, I didn't talk to anybody about it. I kept it to myself. And I moved out of my parents' house when I was 17. And I had a small little apartment. And that's when I felt it was okay for me to respond to the letter, or to maybe even dial that phone number that I received on the letter. Yeah, and that day was huge for me because I remember I was a nervous wreck. It was nerve-wracking to pick up that phone. It was very nerve-wracking to pick up that phone and make that phone call. But I did it, and it seemed like a little bit of a blur to me. I don't even recall the conversation. It was that much of a shock to my nervous system, I guess. I was really, I was really, yeah, I mean, in hindsight, I know I was completely frozen, sort of in a trauma response state still. So a lot of the things in my childhood are blurry to me, and a lot of things I don't really clearly remember, including this phone call. But I remember she invited me to come to Ireland, and I actually went. I think it was maybe a year later. When I turned 18, I booked a flight. It was pretty cheap at the time. It was like $20 to fly from Germany to Ireland, so with Ryanair. And so, yeah, I could afford it. And, I was working. So I, I remember sitting on that airplane and my heart beating as close as, the closer we got to Ireland. And I saw that little island underneath me. We passed over England and I saw the coast. And then I saw Ireland. I have that image etched in my memory forever. That was just amazing to see. And there was no turning back at that point. Yeah, there was no turning back at that point, and I was terrified. And when I finally touched ground, I remember letting everybody go first. I just didn't want to really get out the airplane, but I finally did. And it was very strange because I didn't know exactly what she looked like. I had an old picture of her from when I was 14. But when we walked out, well, I walked with the crowd. That's why I say we. But then I finally stepped out into the area where the people are waiting. I could see her. She was right there, and she could see me. And it was like no mistaking that this was her. So yeah, there was no question in my mind that that was her. And we just locked eyes and we walked towards each other. And I remember she gave me a big hug and I started crying. I just started crying. It was just so surreal. But I also tried to hold back my tears. At the same time, I was just trying not to cry because she was a stranger at that moment. I thought, why would I cry? It's like you're meeting somebody for the first time and you're just sobbing. But yeah, I remember she's like, maybe we can just have a little tea or coffee and sit at this little pub over here before we get on the road. And we sat down, and I remember we were chit-chatting and talking, and she just looked at me in awe. And I looked at her, and there was this woman sitting across from me, and for the first time I saw resemblance in a strange way, because she doesn't look like me. I didn't think she did, but I saw, for example, her hands and her knees and her elbows, and they looked like mine. It was very strange, surreal stuff that I've never experienced before. So yeah, that was very interesting in hindsight. I wish I was more present, but I was kind of it was just sort of, it just happened, it just happened so fast. And the next thing I remember is being on the road in Ireland. She's driving on the other side of the street. For me, the opposite side of the road was terrifying, but they drive on the other side of the road. So I guess the right road for them, but not for somebody from Germany. So it was very strange to drive in this little van she had to her house, and her honking the horn and cussing like a sailor every corner somebody was trying to go past her. So I was like, oh wow. Yeah, so that was my first experience meeting her, and I stayed in Ireland for I think a couple days, maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 days. I don't really recall. And I met everybody, the cousins and the uncles and the grandmother. Yeah, and she took me on this beautiful trip to an island. There was only a little hostel on that island, and it was just us, and we took a bike ride around the island. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, how beautiful is this? The coastline, the water, the air. yeah, we just took bikes riding around the island. Oh, and she took me to the Cliff of Moors, which was amazing. The Cliff of Moor. I don't really know what it's called. Mm, yeah, so that was the first time. I remember sitting there, meeting her wife, meeting her cat. And going to sleep in her house was very surreal. For the first time, laying down in your mother's home, it was a very surreal feeling. And her making salad for me and cooking the next morning was very interesting too, because it was just sort of like, okay, this is what it would have been like, you know, staying here, growing up here. And her instruments everywhere, her music everywhere, you know, just, you know, all of my ideas of who she might have been were not correct. So, yeah, very surreal. That's how I met her. And that's the first time I seen her. That's the first time we connected when I was 17. And I flew back to Germany, and we stayed in touch ever since. So, yeah, the next time I saw her was I went to Ireland one more time after that. And then I flew over there after my grandma passed away to be at that funeral. And so that's how I first met her. And that's how I connected to that family in Ireland. So yeah, I remember also I think it was maybe the next day after I arrived in Ireland, I remember sitting at her kitchen table. Her wife was in the kitchen. She was sitting across from me. And I remember this surreal moment where she apologized to me. And all I could think of was to comfort her in a sense of making it seem like it's okay, it's fine, you know. I had this beautiful childhood, everything was perfect in my life. So I felt sort of like my people pleasing kicking in, you know, my role as as the one who's understanding, I guess. I'm not sure. But in hindsight, I know it was a trauma response as well. You know, I felt really like I had to just tell her over and over again that it was totally okay. And I love the decision she made because I have this family and all of that, you know. And in hindsight, I know that was really, I needed comfort in that moment. You know, I needed somebody who would hold me and say, you know, you don't have to make everything okay. This is not your job. Yeah, I really needed somebody at that moment to help me reflect on the situation. And yeah, I understand her sadness around it, you know, but I didn't understand my sadness. I didn't have sadness, right? I don't, because I was so wrapped up in my story about having this better life, and if I would have been with her, it would have been horrible, and all of the things, you know, because this is all I knew was my life, the way up until this point. So yeah, why would I not cherish that, or, you know, also go with the same story everybody was going with? And that is, she did the best thing for me by giving me away. That's sort of the narrative that I received. And in hindsight, I know that my heart was aching in that moment, and I was in pain in that moment, and before and after. You know, I said it was okay, and I didn't want her to feel sad about it, or I wanted to comfort her in a sense, but at the same time, I didn't allow myself to just feel my feelings. And that's a constant theme throughout my life until, you know, later in my 30s, where I finally understood that my feelings are just as equally important. And I'm not just here to, uh, I'm not just here to, help other people feel their feelings. So yeah, that was a big moment. And, if anybody is in that situation where they reunite with their biological family, I went in there completely green, right? I had no idea what to expect or what would come my way. But, I feel like if I had a little bit more preparation and even therapy at that point, somebody guiding me through this process, it would have been so much better. And the biggest thing for me, the disconnect between my feelings, my body, and the reality of the situation was huge. I wish I was able to really fully embody what I felt at the moment, and I was able to just kind of own myself at that time. I didn't. But yeah, I feel like that is a thing a lot of us adopted people go through, the disconnection from our true feelings, the disconnection from our truth internally, and how it feels in our body, and just disassociating from it all. I feel like being in the fog has a huge is a trauma response. Being in the fog, I think there's an acronym somebody came up with. Sorry, I don't know who, but I think it's fear, obligation, and guilt. We really do feel, I mean, I can speak for myself. I felt this my entire life, but there's more to it. As a somatic practitioner, knowing what my body was holding at the time and having no way to release all of that, I feel like our nervous system is just holding all of these trauma responses from early on, from right after, in my case, from being born and not having self-regulation and co-regulation coming into this world. So yeah, I feel like these trauma responses are within our body, in our nervous system, and I was holding on to all of that in those moments of real connection with my mother, for example. I could not let myself show. I felt like I had to hide who I really was. And I had to sort of play into this narrative of what was expected of me or what I thought other people wanted to hear in that situation, and comforting her and comforting my adoptive mother, and making and reassuring her that there's no threat and that she's my mother, and all of the things that that were put on me, it seemed like at the time, that shouldn't have been on me, Yeah, that's just something I wanted to add, because I feel like there's so much wrapped up in these narratives that is then shouldered by the adopted person. And as an adult, I can shoulder it, but as a child, I mean, I was 17 at the time. I was a child, in my opinion. I have a teenager now. That is not of age. So yeah, I feel like the narrative has to shift. The narrative around adoption has to shift, because we do grow up at some point, and we never regain our full rights as human beings because of the adoption process. So yeah, I wish the adults in my world at the time were more embodying their own, knowing that this was burdening on me. But it's really the way adoption is framed. It's a win-win for all, right? Just not for the adopted person, I guess, because you don't have a say in that situation. And that sort of played out with this whole reunion as well. Everybody had their belief, and my needs were just not accounted for in that situation, So yeah, that's my story. That's that's how I first met my mother.